Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about American fantasy. And this is fulfillment of a specific request from my most epic commenter, Mike H. So I always say, "Oh, American fantasy," right? And he's like, "Hey, can you do a video on this and define it?" Hey, absolutely. That is a great point. We got to define our terms, right? Let me explain to you what American fantasy is. All right, so first of all, I think fantasy was shared with the world before 1892, okay? And, this country had a cool fantasy story, and this country had a cool fantasy story, but it was like the OSR. There was no clear leader, right? There is a clear leader of OSR today. It's Arcane Library Shadow Dark RPG OSR creator Kelsey Dione, but that's new. OSR did not have a leader before Kelsey Dione, right? But she is Hollywood ready. She understands presentation counts. She has the right game at the right time. She's the leader of the OSR. Period. End of sentence. All right. Okay. All right. So but in 1892, J.R.R. Tolkien was born. All right. 1950s, he drops The Hobbit. All right. Let's call it 1952, right, when The Hobbit was published. 1952. There's a new country that owns fantasy. It's British fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien, right, smites every other fantasy author ever, right, and owns fantasy. And British people own fantasy for exactly 22 years, okay? And when did they lose it? When American fantasy replaced British fantasy, okay? And this is the country who has the greatest achievements in fantasy. So, no question, J.R.R. Martin, J.R.R. Tolkien, he absolutely, he locked it down, man. He was like, British own fantasy now in 1952 with the publication of The Hobbit. It's better than anything that's ever been printed. Y'all's better recognize, right? 1974, Gary Gygax comes up and says, guess what? Welcome to American fantasy. J.R.R. Tolkien, you can go kick rocks. You no longer matter, right? And he didn't. And Gary Gygax did two things on that fateful day in 1974. Gary Gygax said, "Hey, I see you, J.R.R. Tolkien, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this thing called Dungeons and Dragons. And what American fantasy will do is it will hand 100 identities to every single person who will play it, and it will hand 1,000 identities to every single person who ever dungeon masters it. And I'm going to transform humanity's relationship to identity and allow and make the most expansive, accessible tool to explore identity that's ever been created in the history of humanity. In addition to that, I'm going to rock the very foundation of narrative, and every story that's told with Dungeons and Dragons will be more valuable than any shaman who has ever told their tribe a story, more valuable than any screenplay that any big or small screenplay writer has ever written, more powerful than any novel that has ever been written. The only things that'll be above a D&D narrative is sacred texts, and D&D will be the most powerful secular identity exploration tool and narrative changing tool that has ever arrived for humanity. And some fools will think it's a game. I see y'all's out there still think it's a game. Jeez. Laughable. Okay. All right. So, American fantasy. Okay, what is it? So let's talk about British fantasy versus American. So American fantasy started in 1974, the day D&D was published. America owns fantasy today. The British can go kick rocks. They're no longer involved into they're tier 2, we're tier 1, right? We own America owns fantasy. So when I say American fantasy, I mean the premier fantasy in the world. What is it? Okay? All right. British fantasy, literary. Thus the Hobbit done put upon themselves the mithril which had been forged in the mountains of Mithral and Dran. Right? What is American fantasy? rock and roll. Whole lot of love, right? It is rock and roll. It is literally a million stories that have been told at 10,000 tables by dungeon masters all over America, right? And it is Sally saying, my half-orc barbarian is going to cut this ASMR in half, right? It's just pure rock, right? And it is, and it's Sally saying, my half-orc barbarian cuts this ASMR in half with her greatsword, right? And it happens at a kitchen table. It doesn't need some tweed jacketed, professor. It's Sally at her table talking to her dungeon master Rachel, and it is rock and roll all the way down, right? And it echoes back to Conan, right? And you look at and so it's personal, whereas British fantasy is impersonal, right? So it is, so it's literature versus rock and roll. It's personal versus impersonal, right? It is a rushing embrace of violence, right? Conan, and basically, so Frodo, ooh, should I take my elven forged shining blue dagger and stab that person? I need to think about it. Conan is like, I'm going to cut you in half, and then when your body slides off over here, half of your body slides off over here, I'm going to cut him in half, and I'm going to cut him in half, right? It is an embrace of blood and violence and action and adventure and momentum, right? Where British literature is very thinky and slow and plotting, right? American fantasy is what Gary said it was, right? Combat first, interaction second, exploration third, sequenced but equal, 33.3% on each, right? But prioritized, right? So you are going to get combat in the game first. You're going to get interaction second. You're going to get exploration third, but they will be in equal parts, right? And American fantasy is, so it is rock. It is literature versus rock and roll. It is personal. It is impersonal versus personal, right? It is a hesitant move towards skirmish versus a embrace of incredible violence, right? And it is and it's better. It's so much better, right? Like it's what America always does, right? Like, I don't know if you guys know this, right? You can get dungarees from any country in the world, or you can get Levi's, right? In Japan, Levi's can be sold for $10,000 or $20,000 a pair, right? They collect Levi's worn by American veterans from World War II, right? They put them in pine boxes with velvet, right? American fantasy is just better, right? So it's literature versus rock and roll, right? It is impersonal versus personal, right? It is a hesitant movement towards skirmish versus an incredible embrace of momentous violence, right? And finally, it is worse versus better. Just like everything America does, it's just better than what the rest of the world does. And when you've seen American fantasy versus British fantasy, you're like, well, of course America owns fantasy now, right? And thank you, J.R.R. Tolkien, legit. We are incredibly thankful for 22 years of awesome, but y'all's done lost, and your whole country's lost, and America owns fantasy today. Every single word of that is my humble opinion. Thanks, Mike H., for the request. Hope I fulfilled it. Please consider subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.